All right, folks, if you can find a seat, we'll get started. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Tricia Mims, the Executive Director of National Park Partners. Welcome to the 16th Annual Moccasin Bend Lecture Series, founded in 2006 by Greg Vital and offered free to the public every year since, thanks to his generous sponsorship. Tonight, our series continues with Dr. Dorothy Canter, President of the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park Campaign. Please join me in thanking Keith Sanford and the staff of the IMAX Theater for hosting us once again in this amazing facility. I'd also like to thank Justin Casey with Helm Projects for producing tonight's live webinar broadcast. Whether you are in the audience here at the IMAX or joining us online, thank you for being a part of this very special evening. Locally, your Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, along with the other 422 national parks throughout the country, is truly an amazing historical and cultural resource, one that welcomed about 650,000 visitors in 2020, despite being closed for several weeks during the initial wave of the pandemic. Your national park offers ample outdoor space, beautiful scenery, and a calming sense of perseverance through times of hardship that provided much needed spiritual, mental, and physical health benefits to residents and visitors alike. The economic impact to our area during that very difficult year was over $50 million, with hundreds of private sector jobs supported as well. So if you haven't already become a part of National Park Partners, please stop by the table on your way out and join us in growing Chattanooga's national park legacy. I'd like to take a moment to thank the National Park Service. I think we have Jim Ogden, the park historian, in attendance tonight, and all of the dedicated men and women who steward the resources at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. Now it's my pleasure to introduce State Representative Greg Vital, founder and sponsor of the Moccasin Bend Lecture Series. Greg is a true champion of conservation, both as a landowner who forever preserved his property and as the president of the board of the Land Trust for Tennessee. Greg has visited over 350 national parks and recently served as president of the National Parks Conservation Association. He's been a steadfast and generous supporter of National Park Partners for decades, and we deeply appreciate his commitment to growing Chattanooga's national park legacy. Greg.
Good evening and welcome. It's a real dream come true to look around and see so many people here tonight and then know that so many people are joining us by Zoom. But as Trish said, this is our 16th annual lecture series, started at 212 Market at a luncheon meeting when we realized the importance of making the relevance of Moccasin Bend Archaeological District more relevant to people, and to also help share some of the wonderful stories of not only Moccasin Bend, but Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park. Whether it's the Civil War story, the early urbanization of Chattanooga, the Trail of Tears, or the national park story in general, as tonight touches on, these are all opportunities for us to come together every fall, and we have for 16 years, and the variety of speakers has been phenomenal. I had the opportunity in about 2008, 2009 to meet our speaker, and I will just say a few words, although Tricia will formally introduce her. But Dr. Dorothy Canter is not only a friend, mentor, national park junkie, and a scientist, and you'll hear all those things this evening. But when I joined the National Council of the National Parks Conservation Association before I went on the board in 2010, Dorothy kind of took me under her wing. She'd been on the board for many years, lived in Washington, D.C. with her late husband, and she kind of walked me through some of the challenges of being on a national board. I had a passion for national parks, and I realized soon that I was taken under the wing by a woman who, when she calls you, wherever it is on national park issues around the United States, people pick up the phone. She makes things happen. And if you don't get her the first time, she'll keep calling you until she gets it done. And that's the story that you're going to hear tonight. A personal passion and a vision of a lady who realized the importance of this story that was forgotten, that needed to be taken to the halls of Congress, who walked those halls with us and other board members to get members of Congress to sign on to that enabling legislation to create a study commission, and eventually signed by President Trump on the last day in office to create and work towards creating a National Historic Park campaign. And so I will let Trish introduce her formally, but it is my honor to have Dr. Dorothy Canter, a personal friend, back here in Chattanooga. She visited several months ago our National Medal of Honor Museum, and we shared some of the ideas there and said, let's take that and incorporate that in the Julius Rosenwald story as we continue to share this story. 8 schools, you'll hear this a little bit later, 8 schools by Julius Rosenwald were in Hamilton County. We're now capturing those stories of individuals who attended those schools and making them into oral histories. And Jennifer Crutchfield is working on that. So fascinating outreach from tonight. We further want you to be involved and to help tell this story and further it, not only of the African-American history of education. 660,000 people benefited from what Julius Rosenwald did, but the combination of public-private partnership, of philanthropy, and individual communities working together for the betterment of the community. Welcome, Dorothy. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for supporting Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park and our National Park Service. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And again, thank you so much for your support. And I would be remiss if I didn't welcome Greg's mother, Miss Rita Vital. She has been here for every single one of all 16 years, 3 lectures a year, every fall. Rita, we love you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dorothy Canter. Dr. Canter has been a volunteer for the National Parks Conservation Association for 34 years, serving on the Board of Trustees from 1988 to 1997. She has visited 322 national park units. And in her other passion, she's an expert in the decontamination of bioterrorism agents and in responding to and recovering from attacks with weapons of mass destruction. Wow. She played an important role in the fumigations of contaminated buildings following the 2001 anthrax attacks. Before her retirement, she was the principal of Dorothy Canter Consulting and also served as a senior professional biophysicist at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Having worked in federal government for 29 years, the last 15 of which she was at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she served as the chief scientist for bioterrorism issues from November 2001 until June 2005. Very impressive, and what she's done for the Rosenwald Schools campaign is equally, if not more so. So welcome, Dorothy. Thank you. And if you have questions, we'll be taking those at the end. For those of you online joining us by Zoom, please enter your questions into the chat, and then we'll save some minutes at the end of the presentation for questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks to the National Park Partners for inviting me, and thanks to Greg, my dear friend, who was way ahead of me on visiting national parks. Can you hear me without this? No. Okay. And thanks also to Rita Vital. I've seen her photo many times on Greg's Facebook page, and I'm very pleased and proud that she's here tonight. So given my bio, a few years ago, I was in Chicago talking to somebody about joining our campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. And the first thing he said to me is, what's a scientist like you doing trying to create a national park? And I said, why not? So tonight I'm going to talk to you about Julius Rosenwald, who he was, what he did. I'm going to talk to you about the Rosenwald Schools a little bit in the beginning of the lecture, and I want to talk more about it when I talk to you about the campaign and how we started and where we are right now. And so let's start. So this is the boyhood home of Julius Rosenwald. He was born in Springfield, Illinois. Both of his parents were German Jewish immigrants to the United States. His father came with very little money, and he started off as a peddler on foot. He gradually raised money so that he could afford to buy a horse and a cart, and he ran around, I think it was around in the West Virginia area, selling the goods. He met a woman, as I said, another immigrant, and they got married. And her family was in the clothing business. They had some stores. The first store that they went and helped manage was in Alabama, and they eventually ended up in Springfield, Illinois, where Julius was born. This is not the house in which he was born, but this is his boyhood home. You can see that his father did quite well for himself from coming with almost nothing. This house is diagonally across the street from the home of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Julius Rosenwald was born in 1862, so he never saw Lincoln because Lincoln left to go to Washington to be inaugurated in 1861. And of course, he was brought back in a casket. And Julius Rosenwald did not finish high school. It's not because he didn't have the ability to finish high school, but he went to New York because his mother's family had wealthy relatives who were in the clothing business, and he went to New York to learn the clothing trade. And he did. And in New York, he and another man started a clothing store, but the big recession came and they had to close it because they just didn't make any money. So he ended up in Chicago, and he had a manufacturing business, manufacturing men's suits. And that's important. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. This is a photo of a young Julius Rosenwald. So he was selling suits. He was doing reasonably well. He wasn't wealthy, but he was well enough off. And he was beginning a family. And his brother-in-law, his wife's name was Augusta Nussbaum before they got married. Her brother had the soft drink concession for the 1893 World's Exposition in Chicago, and he made a lot of money. And in 1895, Richard Sears of Sears, Roebuck and Company came to Aaron Nussbaum with a proposition. Sears had started out as a railroad agent, but there was a shipment of watches, and companies used to do this back then. They would send watches to a store hoping they would buy them. And if they didn't buy them, they went back. But Sears saw these watches and he said, gee, this is a good deal. He bought them. And from then on, he became an amazing salesman. And he teamed up with Alva Roebuck to form Sears Roebuck, starting with watches and then going forward. And Roebuck was a watch repairer. Anyway, they started a catalog business, and they said that Sears could sell a breath of air. He was that good a salesman. He was a visionary at that. But they had the catalogs and they were selling goods, but if they didn't have the good that somebody ordered, Sears said, send them something else. So often almost as many goods were coming back as were going out. It was chaotic. And so Alva Roebuck had had enough. And so Sears went to Aaron Nussbaum. So Aaron Nussbaum, being a good businessman, went to Julius Rosenwald and he said, will you take half? Will you take 30? It was $75,000 that Sears wanted for a half interest in the company. And so he went to Julius Rosenwald and said, will you put up $37,500? And it didn't take Rosenwald long. He said, sure, Richard Sears owes me money. And so that began the odyssey that he went on. And so, as I said, the business conditions were chaotic, but Sears was a visionary when it came to the catalogs. And so Julius Rosenwald had the business acumen. He said that, you had to have quality goods. You couldn't just sell anything. And he brought order to it. He came up with the phrase, satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. And he also, they had space in businesses, in buildings across Chicago. And he decided, we need to put it all together. And what he did is, he built this is a vintage postcard that the campaign bought. He built this merchandising plant in the western part of Chicago, North Lawndale. And this is the original Sears Tower. This is the power plant. This, of course, is the whole merchandising section. There was a train track that came in there. This is where the executive office buildings were, and Rosenwald's office was there. They also had a sunken garden with fountains, that this was for the Sears employees to enjoy in their time off. So when they built this in 1906, Richard Sears and Julius Rosenwald went to New York to get financing for it. And they went to see Henry Goldman. And Henry Goldman said to them, well, why get a loan? Why don't you just go public? And Henry Goldman was Goldman and Sachs. And this was one of their first public offerings. And so they went public, and the rest is history. And Sears became very, very successful. And Julius Rosenwald became richer than his wildest dreams. And so after the war, business was extremely good. And Sears was building up its inventory. And then a recession came. And Julius Rosenwald, maybe it wasn't good business, but he refused to cancel orders. So orders came in at high prices, but the retail price was going way down. And soon it was heard on Wall Street and also in the financial markets that Sears might go under, that they might go bankrupt. But, I'm sorry, I didn't say that they had Julius Rosenwald had a schedule system. Let me finish the other. So Julius Rosenwald, in the end of 1921, came up with his own money, $20 million, to guarantee Sears, and Sears was saved. So not only was Julius Rosenwald the man who helped make Sears into the retailing powerhouse that it was, but he then saved Sears, putting himself at personal risk. To go back, he didn't develop, but he had a man on the payroll who developed a schedule system, because they had all these different goods and you had to get them all together to send out to the customers. And the system was that if products are from the same division, same type of product, they had to be assembled in one day and sent out. If they were from multiple divisions, then they had to be assembled in 2 days and sent out. And the managers of these divisions were held to it. And because if they didn't meet these goals, then they were docked. Julius Rosenwald was a good businessman, but he was a strict businessman. And so this was the schedule system. And Henry Ford came and visited and went to the merchandising plant, and he used that when he developed the assembly line. Okay, so enough about Sears. So Julius Rosenwald was already giving money to charities even before he got involved with Sears, because one of the foundations of the Jewish religion is the Hebrew term tzedakah, which means charity or social justice. And that is one of the things that is impressed upon Jewish people. And he was giving money when he became quite wealthy, he was giving money to the YMCA in Chicago. And this was at the beginning of the Great Migration, and African Americans were coming north. They had nowhere to stay. There were no hotels. They couldn't stay at the white YMCAs. So Julius Rosenwald said to the leaders of the YMCA, I will give $25,000 to any city in this country that will raise $75,000 on its own independently. And by the time that program was completed in the 1920s, there were 24 YMCAs for African Americans across the country, and there were 2 YWCAs. And the important thing is that Julius Rosenwald believed in the challenge grants, and this was one of the first times he used it. He believed that people should have money in the game, a stake in the game. And so, not surprisingly, he came to the attention of Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was born a slave in Virginia in 1856. He went to Hampton, and then he went on to start and become the first principal of Tuskegee. He was a very famous African American, but he was also a consummate fundraiser. So Booker T. Washington comes to Chicago in 1911, May 1911, and Julius Rosenwald has a luncheon for him. And the next day, he takes Booker T. Washington to the Sears plant to strut his stuff. And Washington is quite impressed. And shortly later, he asked Julius Rosenwald to join the board of Tuskegee. And Julius Rosenwald, being a very good businessman, he decides that before he makes such a decision, he's going to go down to Tuskegee and visit it. Now, you think 1911, Chicago to Tuskegee, Alabama, which is near Montgomery, Alabama, that is quite a trip. And so he hired a train car, and his family, friends, his rabbi, Emil Hirsch, Jane Addams, who was the head of Hull House, all came with him. They visited Tuskegee, and this is what Tuskegee looked like back in that era. Keep in mind that the students at Tuskegee made the bricks and then built the buildings that you see here. So Rosenwald was very impressed, and he joins the board of Tuskegee. In 1912, Julius Rosenwald turns 50, and he gives away a lot of money to various organizations, $25,000 of which goes to Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington, who wanted to build schools and had built some prior to then in the rural areas of Alabama, wanted to increase that number of schools. And he says to Julius Rosenwald, can I use some of that money to build 6 schools in rural Alabama for African Americans as a pilot project? Keep in mind, these people had been paying taxes, but they were getting no schools or very inadequate schools from the government. So Rosenwald says, yes, you can use the money, but I will give $300 to each of these schools, and the citizens, the communities, have to contribute $300 themselves. And that $300 can either be money, it can be land, it can be labor, or it can be materials, or a combination of thereof. And the schools were built. And in 1914, Julius Rosenwald committed another $30,000 to build 100 schools. And in 1916, he committed $60,000 to build another 200 schools. And here is a photo of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in Tuskegee in early 1915. These men were of very different backgrounds, but they were both very practical. They wanted to get things done, and they became good friends. Booker T. Washington even stayed at Rosenwald's home in Chicago. Unfortunately, Booker T. Washington had severe hypertension. There was no treatment in those days, and he died unexpectedly in November 1915. So I'm not going to talk much here about the schools, but I'm going to give you a couple examples because I'm going to talk more about the schools when I talk about the campaign. Here's one school. You see the people there outside. The schools were not just schools, but they were important community centers for the children, the parents, the whole community. And this one is this is a sort of poignant photo. It shows you how rural the original schools were. Most of the schools were. And this is a one-teacher school, and you can see the horse, and it's like of another century, which it was actually. And so, and then in 1920, Tuskegee was being overwhelmed with the number of schools, and Julius Rosenwald ordered a study, a review of what had been accomplished, and they decided to move the program under the auspices of the fund that he had just recently created. And after that, and then it was moved to Nashville. And after that, every year, every other year, they came out with school community plans. And the schools from then on had to be built in accordance with these community plans. So here we have, this is a 2-teacher school. There was supposed to be at least 2 acres for the school. There was the windows had to be facing east and west, because these schools did not have electricity, they did not have central heating, and they did not have indoor bathrooms, and here are the privies. So this is a 2-teacher school. From it's a photo from the cover of one of these community building plans. By 1932, when the program was officially ended, there were 5,357 schools, teacher homes, and shops. Of these, nearly 5,000 were individual schools, and they range, whoops, sorry about that, not too IT literate, and they range from Maryland to Florida, from North Carolina to Oklahoma, from Louisiana to Missouri, 15 states. By far, the most schools were two-teacher schools, followed by one-teacher school. And in the later years, they built bigger schools, and you'll see about that in a little while. The most schools that were built were in North Carolina. There were 373 that were built in Tennessee. And so I mentioned before the Julius Rosenwald Fund. I'm sorry for the quality of this. I just picked it off the internet. And it was founded in 1917 for the well-being of mankind. Julius Rosenwald specified that it should end within 25 years of his death. And so the school building program was part of the Rosenwald Fund from 1917 forward. Before that, it was his personal money. But there was also much more to the Rosenwald fund as well, although the school building program was probably had the most money of all of them. And one of the programs was fellowships. And the fellowship program was for very highly talented people, generally in the beginning of their careers, not always. And of the almost 900 fellows, 2/3 of them were African-American and in a variety of different careers. And you're going to see that in a minute. Some people got a fellowship once, some got it, twice, and some even got it 3 times. And I'm going to give you some examples in different fields so you can get a feeling of just how important this fellowship program was. Okay, so one of the areas was for writers. This is Langston Hughes, poet and author. This is Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man. This is Zora Neale Hurston. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she wrote, I think Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is James Baldwin, another writer, very influential. And this most people don't know. This is Lillian Smith. She was from, I think, North Carolina, and she wrote a novel called Strange Fruit. And when I'm finished with these, I'm going to ask a question, but you don't have to answer. Also, 12 of the fellows contributed to the second brief for the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit. And that second brief was pivotal in the decision that the court rendered. So I'm going to go from here. This is C. Van Woodward. He was a white historian from the South. He contributed to the brief. I'm going to skip this slide. This is John Hope Franklin, a very accomplished historian. He ended up being the head of history at Duke University. He came a long way started at Fisk. The first job he had was at Brooklyn College, and in those days, they did not hire Black professors. This is Horace Mann Bond, father of Julian Bond, also was the president of Lincoln University. This is Mabel Murphy Smythe, who came from Montgomery, Alabama, and she was like the head of the non-legal part of the work on the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit. And these two people were very instrumental. They were husband and wife team, Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark. They both received fellowships. She got the fellowship to finish her PhD. They were sociologists, and they did the work on the experiments with showing Black children the white dolls and the Black dolls, and almost all of them picked the white dolls. And it was showing the lack of self-esteem, and that, going to these separate and unequal schools was not good for the children. By the way, this photo is by Gordon Parks, and I'll talk about him in a little while. So I didn't show you all 12, but these are a good sampling of 6 of the people who worked on that lawsuit. And there were others. So there were scholars and dignitaries. points are made about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington not in agreeing, but Julius Rosenwald also supported W.E.B. Du Bois. This is Pauli Murray. She was, like, I would call her a Renaissance woman of the 20th century. She was an activist. She was a lawyer. She became an Episcopalian minister. And importantly, she did research that contributed to the brief for Brown versus Board of Education. Although she did not participate in the work per se, she did the research that contributed to the work. And she also did research that contributed to the case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued before the Supreme Court on women's rights. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg signed her name to that brief, although Pauli Murray had not contributed to the brief per se, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that the work she did was so pivotal. And I'm sorry if I'm going on too long. This is Charles Drew, who worked on plasma, very important man. And this is Ralph Bunche. And Ralph Bunche was the first African-American, I guess he may have been the only African-American US representative to the United Nations, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So these are important people. There were also entertainers. This photo is Marian Anderson singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial when the DAR Constitution Hall would not let her sing there, and Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to sing there. She used her fellowship to go to Europe to study voice, and then came back. She was very popular in Europe before she became popular here. This is the dancer Pearl Primus. This is Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie also got a Rosenwald Fellowship. Okay, so when I was this afternoon, I walked around Chattanooga. I was very impressed with Chattanooga. I'd been here with Greg several months ago, and he gave me a good tour. But this afternoon, I went to the Hunter Art Museum. And so one of the artists that the fund supported was Jacob Lawrence. He became very famous. And there's the Great Migration series that he was able to paint with the fellowship. And half of it's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and half of it's in the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. And there's a work of art by him at the Hunter Museum here in Chattanooga. And so the other artists, I won't really go into that. This is Robert Gwathmey. He was white, but he painted a lot of African-American scenes. This is Elizabeth Catlett, a painter. This is Augusta Savage, who was a sculptor. And this is Gordon Parks, who I mentioned before. He did a lot of civil rights photographs, but he also was a very famous fashion photographer. And so that's all of them. But before I talk about HBCUs, there was something I tried to put subliminal in that there. Number one, it was also, there were white people who got fellowships as well as the African Americans. And for that era, there was a substantial number of women who received the fellowships. So, but to go on, and this is the last slide I'm going to show. The fund also supported historically Black colleges and universities. And we have Fisk University here, Dillard in New Orleans, Tuskegee, it was the Institute, now University, of course, in Alabama, Howard in Washington, D.C. And this is Morehouse College in Atlanta. This statue is of one of its presidents, Benjamin Mays, who was a mentor to Martin Luther King. And I don't have photos, but Julius Rosenwald supported a lot of Jewish organizations. He was the one who bought the two Jewish organizations in Chicago, the one representing the German Jews and the one representing the Eastern European Jews, brought them together and became the first president. I mentioned Jane Addams. And also he was the one who, in spite of where he said his challenge grants, he provided all the initial money to create the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It's well worth visiting. There's a German World War II U-boat down in the basement. So that's the fund. There's much more. but I just thought you should get some idea of the scope and the depth and breadth of what Julius Rosenwald and his philanthropy covered. So moving on to the Rosenwald Park campaign. I think I have enough time to do this. So we started in 2016 and we're still going strong. And I think we're gaining momentum every month, every week. So how did this all begin? It began in September of 2015 with the documentary Rosenwald. And my husband and I were looking for a movie to see on a Saturday afternoon. And I happened to read in the Washington Post a review of this documentary by Aviva Kempner, who is a Washington, D.C. filmmaker. So we went to see the documentary. My husband and I are Jewish. We had never heard of Julius Rosenwald. And I always thought of Sears as being a very WASP organization, which it did become, by the way. So we went to the documentary. We were blown away. It was so inspiring. And at the end, I turned to my husband and I said, there needs to be a national park for Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools. Now, as I said, I didn't know anything about Julius Rosenwald, but I did know quite a bit about national parks. You've heard about that. You don't mean me to repeat it. But I also knew that over the, nearly at that point, there were nearly 420 national park units. Not one of them commemorated the life and legacy of a Jewish American. So that's how we got started. And by the summer of 2016, 4 people got together in a conference room at the National Parks Conservation Association. 2 of the people represented NPCA, National Park Conservation, and the other 2 people represented the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Well, why them? Well, every year they come out with a list of the 11 most endangered historic places. And in 2002, the trust came out and listed Rosenwald schools in southern and southwestern states. And that led to a number of Rosenwald schools being restored, including some in Tennessee. And so 2 of their employees met and we planned a path forward. And so we started by creating a program committee. And 3 of the people on the program committee were retirees from the National Park Service. One was Bob Stanton, the former director of the National Park Service, the only African-American director of the Park Service. I believe Bob gave a talk in this lecture series maybe 2 years ago. And 2 other people who were very important in the cultural resources area, one of whom was the former keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. And these 2 both women said, we need to go out to the 15 states in which the schools were built and go to the state historic preservation officers and get them to recommend schools. And being the scientist, I said, well, we need criteria. We worked with the experts in those 15 states and we came up with consensus criteria. And then we wrote letters to each of the 15 state historic preservation officers. All 15 of them responded. Missouri did not nominate any schools because there were only 4 properties built there. 3 were gone by then. And the other one wasn't in a position to be appropriate for a national park unit. So there were a total of 55 schools and 1 teacher home that were recommended by 14 states. So 56. And then we went and visited 34 of them between May of 2018 and October of 2019. I was going to visit a school in Kentucky and a school in Louisiana, but then COVID struck. And so we never got there. So now I'm going to talk to you about some of the schools that we visited. And since I'm in Tennessee, I want to talk first about 2 schools in Tennessee, which we visited in May of 2018. So the first one is the Cairo, that's the way they pronounce it, Rosenwald School in Cairo, Tennessee. It's a one-teacher school. It was restored. The Tennessee Preservation Trust, is that correct, Greg? Was one of the funders for that, as well as Lowe's. And this is a photo from our visit in 2018. This person here is Alan Spears from NPCA. All of the other people went to this school, including these two people up here, the Brinkley brothers. And the reason I'm pointing them out is because in the next slide, here again are the Brinkley brothers. And this was a photo taken by Andrew Filer. And Andrew's book just came out a few months ago called A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 schools that changed America. Andrew kindly allowed me to use some of these photos in our report on the schools and also for the presentation. And this is a photo of Julius Rosenwald that was in the school from the very beginning. And they're standing on it, it's the front door to the school. So the next school we visited in the same day was Durham's Chapel School, which is only about 2 miles away. Excuse me, it's a 2-teacher school. And again, here's Alan, and here's some people, including me, in front of the school. And here's an important thing. In the 2-teacher schools, they had this divider where they had folding doors. And so when the school was in session, there were 2 schoolrooms, and usually like 1 to 3 and 4 to 6 or 4 to 7. But at other times, they could fold back the doors. This was done purposely so that these places could serve as community centers, and they did. And these schools were very important to the people, not only as schools, but as a place for the whole community to come together, for the communities to support these children, to support them when they got A's. And it was really, I didn't say before, but it was really a partnership between Julius Rosenwald and these communities. There wouldn't be the schools without the communities. They were very committed to them. So those are 2 schools in Tennessee. And then there's a school that's not far from here. It's in like Cassville, I think, Georgia. I drove up today by it. And this is the Noble Hill School. And there was a man named Webster Wheeler, and he had been a farmer and a carpenter from that area. And he went to Detroit to work for the Ford Motor Company. When he heard they were going to build a school, he came back down to Georgia, and he built it with another man, and his son was sort of the gopher to help him. And this is an early photo from when the school was in operation. Well, time passes, and the county decided to build what they called either equalization schools, or slips my mind the other term that was used for them. And so the Noble Hill School closes, and Webster Wheeler's son buys the school and turns it into a shed to store things, and the school deteriorates. But Webster Wheeler's grandson's wife went to the school, as did the grandson. The wife goes on to get a doctorate in education. She comes back and she helps to desegregate Bartow County. And she also helps to restore the school. And today, the school is now the Noble Hill Memorial Center. It's a very inspiring story. And we have another photo by Andrew Filer from his book, which I recommend. And this is this is Valerie Coleman. This is her aunt, Marion Coleman. Both of them are descendants of Webster Wheeler. Marion was the curator for the Noble Hill Center prior to Valerie becoming the curator. And this is Valerie holding a photo of Webster Wheeler back in the 1920s. Okay, I have one more school to talk to you about, so I hope I'll still keep your attention. This is a Dunbar. It was originally Dunbar Junior High, Senior High, and Junior College. It was one of the later schools built. It was bigger. These schools were bigger, and they were built in urban centers. And this school was designed by the same architects who designed the Little Rock Central High School. but they weren't equal by any means. And this school is now a magnet middle school. As you can see, they had a water problem when we were there in 2019. The inside needs a lot of, it needs new electrical system, new HVAC system, a lot of things it needs. And then to show you the comparison, this is Little Rock Central High School. You can see that similarity between the two buildings. The architects were the same. They're about a mile to a mile and a half apart from each other. Little Rock Central High is also still a school in operation, but it's also a national park unit. And I'm sure Greg has been there. So somebody in this auditorium thinks that the Dunbar School should become part of the national parks system, but I don't have a role in making the decision. And it shows that these were not separate. They were not separate and equal. And importantly, 3 of the students who formed the Little Rock 9 went to Dunbar School and helped integrate Central High School. It was very traumatic. And this here is a statuary that celebrates the Little Rock 9 that's in Little Rock, Arkansas. So these are just a few samples of 12 of the 34 schools that we visited, to give you some flavor. And as I said, the communities were involved. A number of families at these schools were involved for 100 years, one generation after another. And also a number of them had a role, some more so than others, in the civil rights movement. And I'll go quickly from here. In 2018, we had a historic context study created for us, published, and that study concluded that Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools are of national historic significance, and that a national historical park would be an important enhancement to the national park system. It's also a very good reference source. It's on our website. It's good to have it list all of the Rosenwald Fellows in the fields in which they got their awards and when. In 2020, we issued a report on possible and sites in Chicago that could be a possible visitor center. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you, which I should have from the beginning. The purpose of the campaign is to create the national park with a visitor center in Chicago and a small number of Rosenwald schools from the states in the South. And all of these sites will be selected by the National Park Service. We collect information, put it together to give to the National Park Service. And then also in 2020, we helped pay for a historic marker in front of Rosenwald's boyhood home. And it was dedicated on February 12th, which was the, Abraham Lincoln's birthday in 2020. It was my last trip outside of DC. And on that day, also, the name of the home, which had been called the Lion House, was changed to the Rosenwald House. Okay, importantly, in 2019, legislation that Greg mentioned was introduced in June by Senator Durbin of Illinois and by Representative Danny Davis of Illinois not to create the national park, but to have the National Park Service do a special resource study of sites associated with Julius Rosenwald and the schools. Importantly, there were 43 co-sponsors in the House, 2 of whom at least are from Tennessee. One is Steve Cohen, and the other is Charles Fleischman. And is Chattanooga in his district? Chattanooga, so thanks to Representative Fleischman. And in the Senate, there was 9 co-sponsors, and the one Republican was Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who was always a big proponent for national parks, and he retired at the end of 2020. And so this bill, as Greg said, it was passed with great support in the House and passed by unanimous consent in the Senate, and President Trump signed it in January of this year. Okay, and we're working now with the National Park Service, and as a matter of fact, we had a meeting in March. Greg is on our board. He's a very active and committed member and contributing member, and we had a meeting with the acting director of the National Park Service virtually, of course, and about the report. And just last month, we issued our report on the 56 Rosenwald school facilities that were recommended for the park and the 34 that we visited. It's a pretty intensive study, and it's available now electronically. We're going to put it on the website. We're going to get some copies printed. We're working with online printers. So we just, as a matter of fact, selected the one. And so we have already given the National Park Service the historic context study, the report on the school or the sites in Chicago, and then this report on the schools. And we have another meeting scheduled with the Park Service next month. So I'm almost finished. And last month, we found out that Congressman Steve Cohn and Congressman Danny Davis, Tennessee and Illinois, wrote a letter to President Biden. And in that letter, they request that Julius Rosenwald be given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And there are 16 other representatives who signed on to this letter. And I can tell you that there is a historical precedent for somebody to receive the award posthumously, and that was John F. Kennedy. And so we're looking into whether we can get somebody in the Senate also to write a letter. And we're working with Aviva Kempner, who did the documentary about a letter writing campaign. So I think this is one of the quotes that's most poignant by Julius Rosenwald. It's made obviously when he was older. All the other pleasures of life seem to wear out, but the pleasure of helping others in distress never does. And so we have a website. We would welcome your visiting our website. You can visit it at www.rosenwaldpark.org, whatever, or you can contact us at info@rosenwaldpark.org. You can write to me at Dorothy Canter at rosenwaldpark.org. We come out with 4 newsletters a year and 4 campaign updates a year, and they contain information on our activities. They also contain information, human interest stories on Julius Rosenwald in the schools. So, one other thing that's not here, we are getting supporters, nonprofit organizations that are agreeing to express officially that they support creating the national park. And as of now, we have 76 such supporters. We have several more almost ready to sign in, and we welcome anybody who knows a nonprofit that would like to support this. My personal goal is to get 100 by the end of the year. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on so long. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I can see.
We did have a couple comments come in on the Zoom.
I can't see with that light.
I know, it's blinding. Briefly, we did have a couple of comments come in on the chat of Zoom. Some folks who went to the Rosenwald School, that was the Roland Hayes School here in Chattanooga, and also mentioned that there's a Roland Hayes Museum in Calhoun, Georgia. Making sure you knew that, Dorothy.
Okay, I did not.
But if there's any other questions to come in on the chat, I'll read them off. Does anyone have a question here? Yes. Jennifer, do you remember all the 8 schools? Yeah. Stand up so we can hear you. Okay. Bakewell, Georgetown, Summit.
Washington.
And that's 8, but research, local research, and particularly people who are alums of some of our local schools suggest that the Eastdale School was also a Rosenwald school. So that would make 9. But at that time, remember, we had city schools and we had county schools. So where Howard High School was the first school that was open to African Americans, it was a county school, it was a city school, and no, Booker T. Washington, oh darn it, one of those was the first high school in the county system.
Awesome, yes.
Now, what I didn't say is that there were 5 schools recommended from Tennessee, and Trish and I are going to see the school, Lincoln School, I guess, in Pikeville tomorrow. There was one in Free Hills, Tennessee as well. We only got to visit 2 of them.
Yes, sir.
You were saying that Rosenwald had a formula of $300 contributed to the school, and then the community was contributing. The last few slides, those were quite large bills.
Yes, okay. Now, that was for the pilot project for the 6th. And overall, for the 5,357 school facilities, it was about $24 million. And Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Fund contributed $4.3 million. The African American communities contributed $4.7 million. Whites contributed a little over 1 million, and most of the funds ultimately were contributed by the local governments. And that's what Julius Rosenwald wanted, because he was helping to build the schools, but they were not going to maintain them. And part of it was the separate but equal, the governments decided to, come up and pony up the money. And one of the things about the Rosenwald schools, they had a lot of light. They were built according to certain standards, but they were meant to be modest, okay, so that they wouldn't upset people at that era. Yes, ma'am, again. Okay, so as I said, the most frequently built school was the 2-teacher. And the reason they call it 2-teacher is that there were more rooms than 2 rooms. And so as you saw with the certain of the schools with those sliding doors where it could be opened up. So inside they had potbelly stoves. They had cloakrooms, and some of them they had like an industrial room. And as I said, they mixed the number of grades. I'm not sure whether the 1 teacher was more of the more elementary grades. As time went on, they required that the students be there for more months of the year. And also the light was these big, many of them had these 9/9 windows, which is representative of Rosenwald schools. And so the light came in from the east and the west, so they got light all day because there was no electricity. I hope that answers it. If it doesn't, I'll do some more research.
Ma'am, you had a question?
Thank you for what you're doing. I'm married to Woody Deutsch.
Oh, yes.
Stephanie, my
Sister-in-law.
say hello.
Thank you. And
And for everyone who's working on this, it's just amazing.
okay, so who is Woody Deutsch? Woody Deutsch is the brother of David Deutsch, and Woody Deutsch, who I've never met, and David Deutsch are great grandsons of Julius Rosenwald. And Stephanie Deutsch, who is a member of our board, is the wife of David, and she wrote this book. I recommend it to everybody. It's called You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South. It's easy to read. It goes into the life and history of Booker T. Washington, the life and history of Julius Rosenwald and the schools. And she's a very committed member of the board, and she is the editor of our newsletter and our campaign updates. Thank you for coming.
Any other questions? Justin, I got booted off the Wi-Fi. Did anything come in on the chat?
You want us to walk away with 4 main points from your presentation today, what would they be?
Well, we need a national park to commemorate the life and legacy of Julius Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Schools. This is a story that's particularly important at this time of great dissension. This is also a story of how immigrants contribute to the American society, and the story often overlooked of the contributions of African Americans to our country.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Let's see, couple more closing.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Jen. Oh, I turned it off.
You're okay.
I had the question for you, Jennifer. On one of those slides, what did you learn about one of the Rosenwald awardees? Okay. Well, I had lunch with Jennifer today, and we established that we're both left-handed. And on the slide, Paulie Murray was writing with her left hand. Yes.
Okay, so, what was one of the things, if you can capture something, one of the elements that was different about the spirit of what was taught and education in Rosenwald schools versus how students are learning today?
Oh, that's, well, they were taught the 3 R's, and I'm a big proponent of the 3 R's. I'm gonna, in these particular schools, they were taught that they could succeed, and the community supported them. You know, if a kid got A's, the whole community supported them. I don't know what's being taught today, but I think the motivation, it was a village and villages, and I think it does take a village, and the support of the parents and the community was vital to the children. Thank you.
Here, I'm gonna jump in here.
Yeah, let me go.
Trade places. Oh, go
Yes.
ahead.
You know, I don't have the answer to that. I know that before Julius Rosenwald, there was a Quaker woman named Anna Jeans who supported training teachers for schools, before Rosenwald schools. And I know Julius Rosenwald and the fund did support some training for schools, but I don't know where the curriculum was developed. I'm sorry. I'll look into that.
We'll adjourn to the lobby. If anyone thinks of another question, we'll be out there for several minutes. You can ask Dr. Canter, and certainly, as she mentioned, you can email her, Dorothy Canter, that's the ER at the end, at rosenwaldpark.org. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks again, Greg, for your sponsorship. Oh, and November 15th, we'll be back here at the IMAX and online for Rivers, Roads, and Rails Transportation during the Cherokee removal with Amy Costine from MTSU Historic Preservation. It's going to be a fascinating look at the Trail of Tears and how transportation networks move through this region and beyond. Go ahead, Greg.
I just want to reinforce the fact that this is from a national level on what's been going on, but Jennifer Crutchfield has been working with us to help identify the stories of individuals or their family members who went to one of the schools in Hamilton County, whether it was Bakewell or Hickson or Georgetown or Summit. So if you know someone, get in touch with Jennifer, because we're trying to document these stories and bring this story locally because it is part of our community. It is part of our history. These folks made contributions to our community. So we want to collect that and make that part of the story that's being told not only nationally, but across the state of Tennessee. Because Tennessee was not the largest state, but we, as was said, we had over 400 schools across the state, and that is a significant number. And these folks really made a contribution to their community. So thank you for being here. And I also will just say that this Saturday up at my farm, the annual 12th annual Buffalo Blessing will be there. So you're all invited. Many of you have been there in the past, but 3 to 7, you can go on Facebook or Instagram and see the directions, but you're welcome to come up, and Native American community will be there, and we'll be celebrating the birth of the buffalo this year and the Trail of Tears. And we'll have some folks from Cherokee with us playing music and the flute. So see you then. Thank you. See you next month here.